Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online. Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
I hold the Schreyer Chair and I'm a Senior Vice President at CSIS. I'm really glad that all of you have joined me for a webinar conversation with Henrietta Fore, who's the Executive Director of UNICEF. It's a privilege and an honor to have my friend, Executive Director Fore, with us today at CSIS. We're going to be having a conversation about how the world has changed because of COVID, what this means for children, and what this means for development. Executive Director Fore, thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure, Dan.
Well, it's nice to see you again. And I'm so pleased that you made time to be with us. I know you're quite busy. Tell us, how has COVID-19 affected children, especially in developing countries where healthcare infrastructure is either weak or underdeveloped?
Well, it's a fascinating time, but it's also a really challenging time. So we are worried that the world is going to go back 20 to 30 years in terms of development, because there is just a huge demand on services. So many of the healthcare centers, whether they are in the developing or the developed world, are really overwhelmed. They are just swamped, and many of them are buckling under the strain. So for many of the children, they're not getting their routine immunizations. And one of the things we worry about now is that measles, cholera, diphtheria, all of these diseases which are preventable are going to be coming back, raging back, and they are going to take the lives of many children. So many of our routine immunization centers around the world, the vaccinations are down 40 to 60%. What it means is that we could lose millions of children to these other diseases. So it is a health emergency, but not perhaps as what we are reading on the front pages of the newspapers. It's also an education emergency. We have 1.5 billion children out of school. I mean, we've never seen this in our world. And children have a different sense of time. So if you're out of school for 1 month or a year, it's a very long time for a child. It means they're missing their friends, they're missing their routines, they're missing a reason to be learning a certain subject. And as a result, life has changed for them. And there are lots of mental health repercussions that we are also seeing. So it's a challenging time, but it's a time when we are working hard and we are seeing some ways that we could come out of COVID stronger than when we entered.
Yeah, I think that's a way we need to be hopeful. And I see it even in the 6 ring counties around Washington, D.C. There's sort of mixed Wi-Fi accessibility even in the United States. And so imagine Haiti or Afghanistan. I believe in Afghanistan, I think most kids are out of school. Maybe in Haiti, they're getting access to school via radio. Maybe in middle income countries, they have spotty access via Wi-Fi, at least in the cities, but in rural areas, maybe not so much. This is an enormous disruption in education. I agree with you about this issue of mental health. How is UNICEF responding to all this? You have an enormous agenda, and this is an enormous challenge. Tell us about that.
Well, let me tell you what we are asked for. So when the pandemic first hit, the first request came from governments around the world. We work in every country in the world, and it was for communication. They wanted to talk to their people, and they wanted to talk in their major languages and in all of their local and indigenous languages to tell them about what COVID was, how they could stay safe, the need for hygiene and sanitation and some physical distancing. So UNICEF began working night and day to get communications out to millions and millions of people around the world. And so that was our first request. The second request that came in is for supplies, gowns, masks, goggles, things for their healthcare workers in hospitals, communities. And our supply chain, half of the world's vaccines go through our doors, and many of the health supplies we work to try to get it to every country. It's difficult now with restrictions on flights, restrictions getting across borders. So humanitarian aid and humanitarian workers are often stopped at the borders, but this is the time when you really need it. You need hygiene supplies, a bar of soap. We need them in hospitals, we need them in clinics. So supplies was number 2. The third area that we had lots of requests on is water and sanitation. As you know, Dan, 40% of the world does not have access to water and a bar of soap. And so we need it at every school, we need it in every household, in every federal building. But until we have that, countries are thinking about, well, how could we get a water system going, both to drink, but also to be able to wash hands so that we can help against COVID. Then the fourth area we had was distance learning. And as you said, there are many young people that are learning by television, by radio, by SMS on their cell phones. They're trying to download digital learning. We have some good opportunities, we think, ahead with moving this in different ways. But education was the next one. And then mental health. We are getting enormous demand in our call centers. So there's a rise in physical and sexual abuse in homes. It is also online, lots more predators online. So children really need to know how to protect themselves, and they need to not fall into depression or despondency or anxiety or stress because their own families are stressed. They need to still have their own dreams. They need to still have a way to learn so that they're thinking about their own futures. It's a very trying time for young people. And it's one in which our teams are hard at work all around the world. But we see lots of opportunities also, Dan.
So, Executive Director Fore, tell us a little bit about some of the opportunities that you're thinking about.
So there are two of them that I believe would be enormously powerful and would change our world. So when we began this year, 2020, it was the beginning of a decade, and we thought that it would be a decade of action and that we would try to address inequality. We did this within the United Nations and the World Bank family of institutions. And we thought at UNICEF, what would be the major contribution we could make for children for inequality? And we focused on education and connecting every school in the world to the internet. Half of the world is not connected to the internet, you know, Dan, but we think that if we could connect every school and every learner to the internet, it would be a great equalizer. And it would mean that every child in this generation would be connected for every other child. If not, we worry that those who are connected will spin away from those that are less connected, who will be left behind.
A digital divide.
Yes, and the internet can be an internet of good things. It can also be an internet of bad things. So we want to school children. We've begun talking to many of the ICT companies who are now zero rating education materials. So if you're a child and you need to download your lesson plans, there's no cost. If we can get that across the world, if we can get up some lower satellites along with the World Bank, we could connect every school to the internet. Then in the evenings, their families and parents can come, use the internet. Whether you're a rural area and you're looking for agricultural prices for the next day, you can, as a family, find the school as being your place where you gather and you learn things together. So we think that education has a chance coming out of COVID at a whole new life. It can be reimagined. Every parent has now realized how difficult it is to be a teacher. So we need this for our children. And the second area that we think we could come out stronger with in COVID is water and sanitation. So every school needs to have a way to wash your hands, to have a bar of soap and a toilet. And if it is secondary schools, should have one for girls and one for boys, so that the girls have a chance to really go to school. And so if we could get good water and sanitation coming out of COVID as an important area for our world, it would make a very big difference. So those are two.
I think it's important that we're hopeful, and I'm of the belief with folks like yourself, folks like David Malpass, creative leaders at the regional development banks, creative aid leaders, philanthropy companies, but also enlightened political leaders in developing countries who want to see this for their societies. This is potentially, if we set our sights and we use the SDGs as a common language or framework or way to measure this, this is a potentially doable thing in the next 10 years.
It is, and it is reminding all of us to just reimagine what the world could look like. I mean, we had not thought that teleworking would work, but here we are in your living room, Dan, and we can do things differently as a world. So why not? Why not make the world better coming out of COVID?
I would argue that in the last 20 weeks, we've done more on teleworking and distance learning, whether we liked it or not. We've all been, I'm going to describe myself as I've been dragged kicking and screaming in the last 20 weeks, doing more on telework or telelearning than in the last 20 years. And I think that's been the case all over the world. We did an event last week at CSIS on how has distance learning and e-commerce been impacted in Latin America by this. And again, I would say in the last 20 weeks, there's been more than in the last 20 years on distance learning or e-commerce or e-government in Latin America, because we've all been forced to. And now, I think we're going to have, like you said, we're going to be forced to reimagine this. It's just the disruption is just, it's an awful disruption. It's an awful disruption. I had several things I wanted to share with you, Executive Director Fore, ask you about. You've done a number of joint studies and declarations that I think are quite important. And I'm sure there's power in having joint UN agents, various UN agencies coming together and working together. It's obviously your member states want that. And it speaks to the collaborative nature of leadership and the collaborative nature of your leadership that you've been working with I think the world of the Director General of the ILO, he's really a very creative person. There's a number of really able leaders in the UN system. But I want to just go through some of them. There's the ILO UNICEF joint statement that's less hopeful. Talk a little bit about that.
So as you know, Dan, we're very worried about unemployment. So if our anticipation is 300 million people will be without jobs, that has an enormous impact on a family. When a family does not have a major earner in the family, it means that many of the poorer households, the children will have to go to work. So as we look at what happens out in times like this, in the poorest countries, the poorest households, especially the girls, they will not return to school and they will be at work. So whether they are in an urban setting or whether they are in a rural setting, it means that children's lives will change. And it is just the economic necessity. Many, many families do daily work for daily bread. And without that, there is nothing to eat at home. So one of the areas that ILO has talked about with us is what happens to the young. As you know, we have some very big demographics in Africa of young. The average age in the continent, sub-Saharan, is 19, 20 years old. It means that they need to be productive. And the young everywhere, they want to leave the rural areas and they want to head into the cities. And yet Africa needs now to be even more self-sufficient with food than it has been. So we need lots of young farmers. And we are going to have to think about how we can encourage more young people to become farmers, to become entrepreneurs. We believe 8 out of 10 young people are going to have to make their own work. They're not going to have jobs the way we have. They're going to be in the informal sector. So they're going to need to learn everything from how to be a motorcycle repair person, to how to put in solar panels, to be an electrician, a plumber, a doctor, a nurse, an engineer. And they're going to have to now, with disrupted school systems, they're going to have to learn many of these skills online. So we know it's a challenge for the world, but there are a lot of these young people, and it's a huge demographic that's moving through the world. There are 1.8 billion of them between the ages of 10 and 24, and we need 10 million jobs a month in this world, and the world is not making those jobs. So with the ILO, we have been talking about how we can change the prospects for young people, how we can give them the skills that they're going to need to make it in the future. But we do lots of work with our fellow UN agencies. We're also doing with UNHCR because refugees are a very important part of our portfolio. We have half of most of the refugee populations are children, and they're on the move, and they're usually in a language system that is not their own. But we've developed a new learning tool, Dan, that you would like to hear about. I bet it's called the Learning Passport. So we did this with Microsoft and the University of Cambridge. It was developed for refugee children so that you could learn your own national curriculum in your own home language.
I
Well,
love
this
it.
will change the world. And so
I love it.
Timor-Leste has now taken it as their national system. Kosovo is on the move. We've got 13 front-runner countries. It could be a game changer for refugees.
I love that. That's very important. I think it's enormously important. I also want to thank you, Executive Director Fore, because UNICEF is the children's agency of the UN system. And under your leadership, you've rightly expanded the definition of what childhood means to expand it to a little bit later into youth, into teenagers and later teenage years, because it's not just early childhood, but it's also this late, I'm going to describe it as later childhood, that's also critical. And that was a missing space in the UN system. But under your leadership, you've taken it upon as, because of the Children's Agency, it's appropriate to define childhood a little bit later than sort of the assumed definition, if I can describe it that way. And I think we've got enormous workforce challenges for young people. We're going to have, as you said, Executive Director Fore, I'm worried we're going to have a doubling of the African continent in the next 25 years. There's going to be more folks living in Africa than folks living in China and India combined 25 years from today. It's an enormous challenge, a huge opportunity, but also an enormous challenge. 10 million jobs a month. This was pre-COVID, pre-everything else. And throw gasoline on the fire with COVID to cause all sorts of disruptions and challenges in addition to this. Wow, it's sobering. It's very sobering. You've had some other reports I think are quite interesting. You had one on, you have an agenda that maybe it's not necessarily this is an agenda for children, that you have a global agenda that's just a UNICEF agenda. Talk about that you put out in April, Executive Director Fore.
So we put out a report on child rights, and child rights are something that we don't feel every day in our lives. And yet 30 years ago, we had a convention on the rights of children, and it's basic things. It's the right to a healthy environment, the right to an education, the right to play, things that you know intrinsically you need for a child's life so that they are happy and healthy and that they will thrive in the years ahead. And we, every year, think about what are the most important issues that we need to look at. And this year, we have a State of the World's Children report that will be on mental health. Last year, it was on nutrition. I mean, there are so many issues that affect a child's life and a child's rights that as an agency, we look around the world and we try to highlight them so that governments, private businesses, parents, families, communities can really focus about how to form a protective and a learning environment around children. They're our best investment. And as they often say, we're 25% of your world, but we're 100% of your future.
That's for sure. One of the other things, you just also came out with a report with UN Women, ILO, and UNICEF on family-friendly policies. Could you talk a little bit about that? And how has I'm sure COVID's disrupted that as well. I know it has.
So this has been a challenge for all of us that work in offices, and we are seeing a very different world. And one of the strains we have, and why we did it with these particular UN agencies, is particularly a strain on women. So when the pandemic hit and many of our colleagues headed home, it meant that all of a sudden, with schools closed, you became a teacher for 5, 6, 7 hours a day. And then people began working late at night, and they'd be working until 2 a.m. and then up again at 6 in the morning. So it's difficult to make sure that you have policies in place that are thoughtful for what the new family demands are. for your own colleagues and your own workers. So we put out a set of guidelines, flexibility for working arrangements, the ability to have family-friendly policies. So, do you have maternity leave for both fathers and mothers? Do you have the ability to have sick leave? Do you have insurance that's appropriate? We also have found that there is not enough information that goes out to many of the workforces. So many of us have people working for us from around the world. They are in a city that they do not know, let us say New York City. They are there on their visas. They don't know what hospital to go to, where to find insurance coverage. They're worried for their security and that of their children. They try not to take them into clinics. They begin to see that there is anxiety and depression in their children or in their spouse. They don't know where to take them. So we have suggested guidelines in which you get this information out to your employees, and you also offer it online to your employees so that they can find the help that they need and that they become the workers that you want. But everyone in any of our at any of our offices is, number one, a parent, number two, a teacher, and then number three, they are a colleague, a worker at a UNICEF or a CSIS. And we have to remember that and make sure that we set up guidelines that allow them to do that.
Thank you. I think that's very important that you say that. I think we forget that workers are not automatons, and they have a whole life outside of the office, and it impacts them and impacts everybody. And so I really appreciate, and I think that's an important statement that you all put out. I wanted to know, you've had several past lives. One of your past lives was administrator of USAID. I wanted you to talk a little bit about, how does UNICEF partner with the American government, with AID, and also how do you partner with other aid agencies? There's many generous countries that are supportive of UNICEF's work.
There are. So we share this past, Dan, and USAID is a terrific partner. So we work with them all over the world, and we've been working with them in this pandemic. And we work on water and sanitation systems. We work on education, nutrition. We've recently been working on some interesting data programs. So there are two ways that we use data within the United Nations and the bilateral agencies. One is that we actually track what's going on, and it's fascinating during this pandemic. Every country and every county is approaching the pandemic differently, so we will have excellent data about what's worked and what has not worked. But collecting of that data means that we're able to customize in every country, in every environment in which there are habits and customs that we need to adapt to. So the data collection is very important. But the second way that we use data is we use it in a predictive manner. So you saw it during Ebola. Where would Ebola spread to? And we could track it using cell phones to know where people were moving. Zika, where was it going? Now with COVID, where is it going? Where are the trends? So predictive data is very useful, whether it is in droughts and crops.
Famines.
Yes, predictive data is very useful. So there's some interesting new areas that we're going into, and I think artificial intelligence will play a big role in this. We're looking at a lot of innovations that we believe that American companies will be deeply involved with. So USAID is a great partner worldwide. We also work with bilateral agencies and multilateral agencies around the world, and they are enormously powerful because they bring different points of view, and they bring their own country's commitment to our assistance. So let's say in Jordan, we have online learning systems for the refugees in the camps. And that's because the government feels strongly that anyone who is a guest in Jordan needs to learn. In Cox's Bazar with the Rohingya, we are doing lots of information about health services and what that could look like. And that is extremely important, and with help from all around the world. particularly the Japanese government, and because they believe strongly in primary health care and that there should be primary health care everywhere in the world. It is a goal that we all dream about, but you should be able to walk somewhere with a sick child so that you can get health assistance. And then when you look at some of our other countries, no matter where they are, some are small island states. It is difficult to get there. And so we will get help from another government. So the Australian government often helps us in the Pacific Island nations so that we can get supplies there. We're pre-positioning supplies. We are a very big humanitarian supply hub. And as a result, it's important that these countries feel safe, that they feel that they're able to get the supplies just like other countries somewhere in the world. And so this is a very big network of development agencies, of foreign affairs ministries, of health and education and agriculture ministries, but we're all working together. And Dan, it's particularly important that we work with businesses because businesses become our partners for new products and services and the ability to get these products out to people. So there's some excellent new partnerships that are just forming. We have about 10,000 suppliers. We are approaching now 1,000 new suppliers. We are interested in lots of new relationships with companies. So we're working 24 hours. Anybody please send them our direction. We can use help from everyone in the business community.
Thank you, Executive Director Fore. I've got several questions from the audience. One question is how is UNICEF thinking about COVID's impact on children in indigenous and traditional communities in the Amazon?
So this is a very important part of our world. We do not wish to lose connection with our indigenous communities. So in Venezuela, for instance, in the southern Bolivar state, we have some programs there on water and sanitation and information about how to stay safe. We also have programs in Peru and in Bolivia, and these are all for the indigenous people. It's in indigenous languages. They're biosafety kits, they're hygiene kits, there's communication. Part of how you keep your community safe is that you arm yourself with knowledge, with education about what is coronavirus. Is it important to physically distance? What about a mask? And one of the interesting things, Dan, is that lots of young people want to roll up their sleeves and be part of it. And so young people all over the world are sewing and making masks, and that's good. And that will also change the indigenous communities.
Great. Talk about, you have this report. There's another question is, what are some of the preventive measures that could be taken to mitigate the increase in child labor as a result of COVID-19?
So child labor is a current problem, and it's an increasing problem now with the socioeconomic declines. As we talked about earlier, it's going to be very difficult for many of the poorest children to return to school. It means that they will be either working on the streets or working in the fields, and their parents just simply will not be able to send them to school. And we're particularly worried about girls. So everybody who can raise their voice that children belong in school and not at work would be wanted, needed. So raise the alarm that children should be in school. That's the number one. The second one is if you are a corporation or if you're a nonprofit foundation, we have so many nonprofits that are partners of ours and we do the work together. But in any of those, if you see a place where there is child labor, go in and talk to the people, tell them why they shouldn't be doing this, ask them and see if they can help a little bit with tuition so that the children can go to school.
How do you partner with USAID as related to water and sanitation for informal settlements? And someone references here a Nairobi slums as an example.
So Kibera and many of the urban slums are the areas that we really should focus on as a world. USAID has been working there for years and they really know it. And with UNICEF, we have been working on water programs that allow you to have a water tap that you can turn on. You can pay for water right there. You can do it electronically, and you can get a bucket of clean water to take home for drinking. We also have been working on water that could feed the urban gardeners so that you can grow some vegetables, onions, cassava, etc. But ways to give more nutrition into foodstuffs. You know, nutrition for children is very important in the very early days of life. The first 1,000 days are very important for building strong bones, but also strong brains. It's when the brains are first forming. And so if you don't get good nutrition in those years and up to the age of 5, you can have lasting defects such as stunting. And stunting is not something that's reversible. So we do not want that. We have about 142 million children that are stunted right now. And so these programs where you can have urban dwellers growing food are very important. And the water programs are part of that for drinking water as well as for agriculture. And then for water and sanitation, these joint programs have changed lives. It brings hygiene to a community. It means that a school can have water. It means that a community can have water. You can wash your hands and you can have water to drink. They are life changers.
Executive Director Fore, there's a question about how is COVID impacting girls in a disparate way as opposed to boys?
Well, with COVID, we've entered a lot of lockdowns or some version of stay at home. We wish in our world that every family was a safe place, but it's not. There is a lot of sexual and physical violence that goes on at home, in homes. When we look at the statistics and why the call centers are so much in demand right now, it is often because of girls being worried about staying at home. So they want a safe place to go. In some places, Argentina, they've opened up pharmacies so that pharmacies become a safe place where you can run to if there is abuse going on in your home. And girls need this. They need the ability to have a safe place. So do women. But when there is a safe place, they need to have a place they can call so they can get psychosocial support and that they can get some help if there is physical or sexual abuse occurring in their home. There is also now the effects just starting for what we saw during Ebola in Sierra Leone. Half of the girls who were at home were in the poorest areas and they had to stay home. Pregnancy rates doubled. Now that does not have to be pregnancy from someone within their own household, but in their community. It's because of the lockdowns. They're not at school. They're not in a place that's safe. And we're not able to see as much child abuse because teachers are often the ones that alert us to child abuse. We're not able to stop as much in the way of teenage pregnancy, early child marriage. Everyone is worried, and so that becomes an issue. And then child labor. So girls are most at risk, and we need to protect our girls. We need girls in our world.
Absolutely. I think that's a great place to end, Executive Director Fore. Thank you for your leadership. I expect to be working hard to support what UNICEF is doing over the summer. I'll be following up with you. I think what you're doing is just really, really important. Thank you for your leadership. Thank you for all that your colleagues do at UNICEF. It's a very, very important agency. Thank you for the time today.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to see you, and thank you for helping us reimagine what the world will be like after the time of COVID. So thank you.
You'll be hearing from us. Thanks a lot, Executive Director Fore.
All right. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.